Right. Hi, everyone. Just wait while everybody has a bit more time to join. Okay, everybody's coming back from lunch and or dinner or breakfast, depending where you are. So welcome. Right. So I'll get started now. So I hope you have had a good lunch, dinner, breakfast, etc. Welcome back to the government trap at MapCamp 2022. So this session, it really takes me back to my roots as a software developer. So I spent a lot of time with open source software, not just using it, maybe grappling with it is more apt, but also creating it and contributing to other people's projects. So it really is my pleasure to be hosting Amanda Brock, the CEO of OpenUK, and Clare Dillon, an open source advocate based in Ireland and executive director of the InnerSource Commons Foundation. So Amanda, I understand you've got some thoughts to share with us on open source policy in government. And Clare, I know you've been working in Simon's government research group recently. And so we're expecting to see lots of great stuff coming out of your group, which I understand you're going to be using to explore open source areas that are ripe for investment. So yeah, really looking forward to this. So let's get started. Over to you, Clare.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thanks for inviting me to be here. So I am just going to share my screen, and hopefully you can all see that now. Yes, I'm going to talk about mapping open source in government, and in fact also data and standards as well here at MapCamp. And so first of all, I'm just going to start a little bit about who I am and why I'm here. So Steve gave a brief introduction, but to let you know, I'm the executive director of InnerSource Commons. I'm also, and InnerSource, by the way, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the use of open source methods and practices, but behind the firewall to create proprietary code. I'm also involved as one of the community organizers for a network called the OSPO++ network, or the Open Source Program Office network for folks who are trying to create open source program offices in public sector organizations and universities. And I'm also involved, one of the co-founders for Open Ireland Network, which is a network or community of folks who are trying to promote the use of open source in Ireland. So they're my varied caps that I wear at various different times. I also happen to be a mapping fan. So even before I got involved in many of these organizations, I'd been following Simon and the mapping movement. This is my third map camp. I really love it. I've always dabbled in mapping, but probably never brave enough to get into it too seriously. So when I saw the tweet from Simon last January asking people to get involved in the research projects related to the various different areas that he was looking at, I thought this would be a marvelous way to actually get serious about mapping and learn a little bit more about it. And when I was talking to Simon about it, we decided that I would go into the government group because there was a good alignment with some of the other work that I was doing and some of the folks I was talking to in the context of, say, open source program offices and governments and things like that. InnerSource as well. At the moment, we would have about maybe 700 organizations that have participated in InnerSource Commons, and they would span corporations, but also government organizations. So I'm going to jump right in, and what I'm going to show you here today is the map that we created in the government research group around open source standards and data. I want to say right now that I am, as I mentioned, and a relative newbie to actually getting into mapping. So what I really wanted to do today was hopefully kind of outline how the map evolved and give you some of the background and a summary of the discussion that happened with, over 20 members of folks that are in the group, and they span, they're based all over the world. Some folks working in government, some folks working in organizations that work very closely with government, but all sharing their background information in a whole wide range of subjects. We've talked about many different areas, but this particular topic of open source standards and data It lasted for, I'd say, about 5 different sessions. So we've got about 5 hours worth of discussion with about 20 people that I am trying to summarize into approximately 12 minutes. So bear with me as I go through this, but hopefully it'll give you an idea about how the process went. So I'm going right into the map. I'm using the online Wardley mapping tool, but I'm not doing it live because I'm not brave enough. So I've taken some screenshots and hopefully I'll show you how it evolved. So we started with government, naturally. And then we realized that government, generally speaking, has a society that's related to it, and the society often has citizens in it. That's a fairly common scenario. But then a government also has policy and how it enacts its rules and its politics. And of course, it also raises tax. Pretty, for not maybe as long as how debt has been around, but certainly taxes have been around for a very long time. So nothing surprising there. And citizens often need services. And this is where we get to an element in mapping called a pipeline. So you can see here as services is represented as a pipeline. And a pipeline in this instance, one of the things I just wanted to call out, it's not necessarily that we're saying that the proprietary services are evolving into public owned, but what we're saying is that pipeline can be a number of components that are all evolving themselves within that pipeline. So just to note that these are other components within the services pipeline. Services might be proprietary services or public owned services. If they are proprietary services, they need corporate funding. If they are public owned for services, they need public funding, and the public funding would come from tax. And of course, services are often nested services. They have dependencies between them. Services come together to create a bigger service that might be given to a citizen. So you might have, for example, the health service working with a shared services organization with government to provide a digital service that they would give their citizens. Government also needs legitimacy. And this was a topic that we talked about in the context of just making sure that government can do their job, because if they're not considered to be legitimate, then no one will listen to their policies or their rules and it won't be effective. So we know that the governments need legitimacy. And the idea of legitimacy is very closely connected to that of trust. Now, trust itself is a pipeline. There are many elements contained within the nature of trust, but one of those elements or components is integrity. And citizens really need that kind of a trust and want to believe that their government has integrity so that they can actually follow the rules willingly, and that's otherwise the rule of law might break down. And what's associated with integrity, it needs transparency often. So in order to build trust, oftentimes you need to be transparent about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how you're doing it in order for citizens to be able to trust that work or the services that are being provided for them. Interestingly, we also had this discussion about the idea of society and government needing the idea of success. They need to be successful. If a government or society isn't seen to be successful, they will be probably overthrown. And so in order to be able to work effectively, they need to be successful, or interestingly, perceived to be successful. Because in some instances, we were noting that sometimes success and the perception of success may not be the same thing. So you could be successful, people don't think you're being successful, that's a problem. You could be perceived to be successful, perhaps not successful, that's also maybe a problem. But in the cases of success, you really need this idea of advantage. Now, again, advantage is represented as a pipeline within the map. And the idea here is that when we think about a society being successful, it generally means that they have an advantage over another society, perhaps in a different country, or perhaps their own society in a different context. And when we think about advantage, it could be a large number of types of components within that. Perhaps something like a society may be more innovative than another society, or it may have a different kind of social intent, or it may be more efficient, or it may be able to collaborate better with other societies or within themselves, and often in the terms of actually creating services. So there also is a connection often between the idea of policy and social intent, in that oftentimes policy is trying to positively impact social, have a positive social impact or a strategic impact within society. Now, at this point in time, you might be looking at this and going, this is a lovely map that's evolving, Claire, but there's actually been no mention of open source data or standards. So where are you going with that? So at this point, I'll say, thank you for your patience. And here we go with the idea of where open source data and standards comes in. But before I do, because I forgot one build on the slides, we have the idea of risk mitigation. So there was a concept within the discussion about the idea that if you are to have a successful or a perceived successful society and government, then you have to be able to deal with issues as they come up. So for example, if there's a natural disaster, the government needs to be able to mitigate against that risk and help with flood relief and things like that. So this is an important part of making sure that you have a successful government. And now we have the concept of open. So when you have a services for citizens or a set of services, then oftentimes they are made up of a series of constructs like, and certainly digital services, like processes, APIs, code, and data. So all of those things come together in order to be able to create a particular service. And what this mapping group was saying, that that particular pipeline is evolving from this idea of being more of a kind of a convergent set of ideas, but it's evolving over time to be more open. And it's doing that because of a number of these dependencies that we've outlined here. So for example, in order for groups to be able to collaborate in the creation of services, oftentimes it is very important for them to use open constructs like open data or open standards, and sometimes open source code. So we talked about the scenarios whereby using open source can actually help with the collaboration of creating services in various different scenarios. Similarly, if you're looking for social impact or to increase social impact, then oftentimes if you make your open source code, if you make your source code open, it can have an additional social impact. The kind of way we were thinking of it there was the idea that you might actually create a piece of source code, a service that could be used in one country that perhaps has a lot of budget to create it, that could be taken and used in another country, maybe of limited means. And in that way, you'd have a broader social impact than you would if it was proprietary code. Once again, we talked about transparency and the link to open. That's a pretty obvious link. But you know, there have been many examples whereby source code has been made open in order to increase the trust in that source code so that citizens have autonomy to be able to see what's happening in the source code that is affecting them, and also be able to necessarily make changes to that. And that's a great enablement factor that increases trust in government and in the services they create. And again, there was a discussion about how innovation is also tied to these open constructs, so that many times there often can be an opportunity to increase the level of innovation if, for example, people are able to grab some source code and then build on top of that really effectively by creating layers of additional innovation above and beyond what the original product was. So in that respect, we actually mapped and put in here this idea of how open constructs are evolving over time. You'll note here as well that there's a little black mark on this evolutionary line. And in that little black mark would represent inertia or friction in the evolution. And what we noted was that oftentimes, sometimes advocates for proprietary code or proprietary companies can provide friction in this evolution. And indeed, perhaps some internal forces within an organization may actually provide friction in this evolution towards things being more open. I was listening to Liam Maxwell's talk earlier, and he talked about the Department of No. I thought that was brilliant. So the idea being that sometimes these internal forces can cause this inertia and friction in the process. All of these open services do often require resources, money, and/or staff to be able to build them. But more importantly, we noted that they really require a lot of awareness. And this perhaps is more of an emerging practice. The idea that people would be aware of, well, perhaps less emerging would be the idea of being aware of an asset list. So knowing what kind of open source code is out there to leverage within government organizations is an essential part of the process. But then also perhaps understanding the situational awareness of why or how you might want to open your source code. So a really interesting part of the discussion here was actually around why you might not want to actually open your source code. And I think it's worthwhile mentioning that it was agreed that there may be times when you don't want to have open source code. Some of the examples might be, for example, if you're looking to build something new and there's a proprietary service sitting there ready that's already available, then why would you go and build something new and make it open if there's something that you might be able to use quicker or more efficiently sitting there? Similarly, perhaps some open source code projects may not run as cheaply as some proprietary source code, some proprietary services that might be in the marketplace, in which case you might make a decision for efficiency reasons that you might go with the alternative and not go with open source code. Or the example was used that perhaps you're in a department where you don't necessarily have the skills there to actually build open source services. And in those scenarios, in those scenarios, perhaps it is better for you to actually build an open source code and not necessarily, to build proprietary closed source code and not necessarily open source code. That may not be the right strategic decision in the long term, but it may be the decision that you might make in the short term. So they were some of the discussions that we had in that respect. We are saying that the awareness is also evolving over time. And we also noted that there may be some friction or inertia in that process of evolution, sometimes caused by management consultants or other internal consultants that may have an opinion, a very strong opinion one way or another. So that was one more element actually on the map, and that was skills. And this is a very important discussion where we talked about the need to build up the skills within an organization in order for people to be aware of the pipeline and the supply chain of software that's available, to be able to have that situational awareness, to be able to understand the asset list that's available to them, but then to also be aware about how to do, for example, have social impact, or to be able to understand the reasons why you might want to use open source in the broader context. So that was the map as we ended up having it. And after we finished doing that mapping, we started talking about the areas for investment. If we wanted to accelerate what was happening, if we wanted to put our money where our mouth is and then actually try to make open better in government, where would we invest? So looking at that, we actually looked at this with three lenses. One was, if you were the government, where would you invest? The second one was, if you were citizens, where would you invest? And the third one was, if you were a corporation working with governments, where would you invest? And I will say, that actually, in many respects in this list I'm about to go through, the answer was everywhere we just mentioned. So there was no real distinction or saying that any one of these might invest in one area, but that the others shouldn't. For the most part, all of them, it was suggested that all of them should invest in all of these areas I'm just about to go through. First area was the idea of building skills to understand that supply chain, unsurprisingly, but also to understand why and when and where to use open source and how and what's out there today. That was an area that was discussed. The second area was skills around the building of open source projects. So from an engineering perspective, understanding how to put the code and the data, open data together. The third one was skills related to the community or the open source ecosystem, understanding how to operate in that ecosystem. The fourth was the idea of general collaborative skills. So, you might know how to build it, but how do you actually form the collaborations that are really useful? The next one was the idea of connecting skills and the idea of policy and transparency, increasing the levels of transparency for government. And perhaps looking at the link between policy and the impact, strategic and social impact. Next was the idea of increasing perception of success, maybe through PR, or in fact, just increasing the number of services that are built. Maybe looking at the funding that's there and how you would increase that funding flow, or looking at a registry for understanding what kind of services are out there today, or just building more common stuff that we could all use. That might be a factor for increasing the level of open. And the winning areas, because Simon didn't let us actually decide to go for all of the above, but if we had to vote, the areas were that we should increase the number of skills around supply chain. Secondly, our skills around collaboration, general collaboration skills. And thirdly, that we should build more common stuff. And that was a summary, in a little bit more than I had intended, of the mapping group's research. So it's imperfect, yes, but it's also open source, another sign of where open source can be very good for collaboration. So you can improve it there if you'd like. And I guess we'll chat after the next presentation. So thank you very much.
That was brilliant. Thanks, Claire. So yes, yeah, we should hand over to Amanda. Who's
We
going to talk
should. Let's
to
see
us
if
a
we.
little bit more about big picture, right?
Yeah, let's see if I can get the screen share working because it wasn't.
Yep.
Now, you
Okay.
see my screen now?
We can see your desk. We can see your desktop. Yeah, and
See my
PowerPoint.
desktop? Can you actually see my deck?
Now we can see a PowerPoint deck. Yep.
All right,
just the
you're
deck.
seeing it in the reverse order very quickly first, just what you wanted. Let's get rid of this chat as well because that's going to distract me. I could probably, yeah. So it's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me along to Map Camp today, and it's great to follow Claire. I think what Claire was just talking about is really fascinating, and a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about is the stuff that I think big picture will fit around that mapping and may actually influence some of the thoughts that you have afterwards about the suitability of that map, whether there's any changes, some of the frictions that you were talking about too. And I've responded to some of the chat. There's a few different comments going on there, and I might respond to some of it more at the end. So I'm Amanda Brock. I'm the CEO of OpenUK, and we are the industry organisation for the business of open technology. Now, I ended up in open source completely by accident at the beginning of 2008 when I joined the UK's biggest open source company, Canonical. I joined as the first lawyer. I was general counsel there for 5 years, and I set up and ran the legal team. And I've spent most of the last 15 years engaged in the open source community, or 14 years engaged in the open source communities. The last 3, I've done nothing but that. I think 5 years, so about 10 of those 15 years doing nothing but open source. And in particular, I've been thinking strategically and from a policy perspective and a government and public sector perspective over the last 3 years at OpenUK. So as well as my main role, I sit in a number of advisory boards and different committees and things. I chaired the UN's Technology Innovation Lab Open Source and IP Advisory. I had my first public appointment, which is the Open Standards Board that I joined last year. And this year I stood for election and was appointed as a board member of the Open Source Initiative. So I do a lot around different organizations and open source. I also write and I have edited, and it's the only time you're ever going to see me editing other people's work. It's an atrocious practice. I've edited a 24-chapter, 600-page law textbook for open source, which is called Open Source Law Policy Practice. It's published on the 28th of October by Oxford University Press. You'll see the link in the slide there. It's actually also open access, non-commercial, but open access. So if it's something that you might find useful, please take a look. I actually worked very hard on the index as part of this terrible editing process and tried to make it something where you would find what you would need. And we're actually launching the book at All Things Open. I think 6 of the 7 female authors, I'm also an author, are going to be on a panel that I'm moderating at All Things Open. And as I say, I also spent a lot of my time speaking, traveled the world speaking before lockdown. I've gotten very used to situations like today, where I'm back in my house. Normally I'd be in my kitchen and the cat would be harassing me, but I have decorators here, so you've got me sitting in a slightly awkward place, but I hope that you can all see and hear okay. And my little cat Dundee has become a world leading expert in open source too. He's certainly better known in this space than I am. OpenUK is an organization that's just about 4 years old, and I joined as CEO on the 30th of November 2019. Very quickly, I brought together a board and we looked at what the strategy should be. And we realized that it's UK leadership in open technology. A year later, we revisited that and we realized that you can't have open technology without global collaboration. And we really had to be very clear about that. Now, you may not be familiar with open technology, and this slot is built to be talking about open source. And open technology for us is defined as open source software, open hardware, and open data. And those 3 opens, I think, are absolutely critical to everything we do. We're a very different organization. We're one of the most diverse organizations you'll find in open source and possibly in tech, certainly in UK tech. And we have a great group of people involved. So there are 2 of us employed now by OpenUK. And then we have a board of 12. We have a leadership team, many of whom are pro bono, some are contractors. And then we have a whole raft of ambassadors and a number of other volunteers around committees. So we have about 130 volunteers who make the work of open source in OpenUK happen. And we work on 3 pillars: community, legal and policy, and learning. From a community perspective, we bring together the leadership of Open within the UK, and that allows us to cascade our messaging and the work that we do. And we do that through things like awards and events, and we showcase the work that these people do. We use their collective voice to have influence, and this is where we start to think about what Claire was talking about in your mapping and open source. So we used to have influence on laws and policies. We have a legal group who responds directly to laws and policies, to laws and regulation, and we do a number of different policy activities, as you'll see there. The European Commission recognised us as the UK's open source organisation. And some of our broad-ranging legal work has included being part of the amicus brief in Google v Oracle, the open source amicus brief. I think we're the only non-US organization. And then we responded to something that I am going to talk to you about, which I think is entirely relevant to mapping, which is SBOMs and supply chain. And we responded to the Biden ordinance in June 2021. It was issued in May 2021, and it starts to talk about supply chain and open source. I was about to start talking to you about it, but I will hold off. We do a lot of reporting. You'll see our State of Open reports. Now, these were set up specifically for government, and these were set up to try and explain to government the situation around open source in the UK. We're a centre of excellence. We contribute vastly to the economy, but it's not something that's ever really been recognised. And we talk through our reports about that and through our other activities, like the Summer of Open Source Software Security, again, something that was designed to be educational for the public sector and government as well as enterprise. And that Summer of Open Source Software Security actually quite pleasingly has been recognised as one of the key open source initiatives in security this year. We also have a focus on sustainability, which I just want to mention because we're hosting an event on the 16th of November in Edinburgh. And we delivered last year something that I think will appeal to mappers, which is a blueprint for a open technology data center. And that blueprint, along with this year's blueprint, which will be delivered in November, this year's blueprint is on electric vehicle charging, will be available on GitHub, and we're looking to build communities around those. But obviously, the sort of mapping type process is very involved in getting to a stage where you have identified the key components and pulled them together. And I've mentioned community and legal and policy. Our third pillar is learning, which Claire has also alluded to. So I'm not going to go into too much detail. Now I'm going to talk to you on a slightly more strategic, big picture level than Claire. She's talking about the implementation of the thoughts. I'm going to talk to you a bit more about those thoughts. So when I joined OpenUK at the end of 2019, what we were seeing is Europe focusing on its digital decade. Ursula von der Leyen was just appointing, or had just appointed, Marguerite Vestager as the VP for digital, and she was in her appointment saying how important this was. And she was talking about geopolitics, she was talking about how we were witnessing major shifts, but most importantly, what we do now will determine what kind of world our children live in and will define Europe's place in the world, creating a Europe fit for the digital age. And what we saw at that time, just before the pandemic hit us, what we saw was a focus on digitalization, a focus on a digital economy. Of course, the pandemic came from left field, none of us expected it, and it also had an impact on digitalization. This is a little known Scottish variant, you'll recognize it, I'm sure, but you certainly can hear it coming. The pandemic had a real impact on all of us, and it had an impact where we saw more and more adoption of digital technologies, more and more software, and of course, more and more open source software. So Claire's talked about open source, but hasn't explained what it is. So what is open source and why does it matter today? Well, I think we could all recite together, if you're ready, the 10 points of the open source definition. And I will say that almost nobody on this call, myself included, could do that. So none of us really think day to day about what open source is. And what we tend to use as our definition is a definition that governments have used. And they've used a definition that's based on an economic driver. And the economic driver is why they want open source adoption in the main. And that economic driver is twofold. Firstly, what we see is a desire to avoid lock-in. And secondly, we want to create code that can be recycled and reused and is good for the public sector. Now, there's more to open source than that. There's a whole load of stuff. You can see in here things like no discrimination against persons or groups, and no discrimination against fields of endeavour. So those kind of things are very relevant, and those are at the heart of a lot of the friction. Claire talked about friction in utilization and of open source, and what happens is when a market is disrupted, those who are being disrupted don't like that, and their way to respond is friction. And that friction for open source is often emerged in fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Lots of rumors and smoke and mirrors going on. So I think it's really important that we start to talk about what this definition is, and that we understand that legal definition of open source, which is generally used in the public sector and government, which is that open source software is code which is shared on a public repository like GitHub, and that it has an OSI approved license, which means the license meets these 10 points, these 10 OSD definitions. But open source is much, much more than that. And as we go through this talk, we'll understand why it's more than that, why things like the documentation, the building of communities, the collaborative process, thinking about commitments and how software will be maintained and kept secure in the future really matter. And what we've seen in government all too often is that they will simply follow that legal definition, that simplistic definition. And what you end up creating isn't really true open source. It's very possible in that definition to create code that is in a proprietary environment and simply shared at the last minute, open source, thrown over the fence, as we like to say, and which doesn't have all the goodness of open source because it doesn't have all of that documentation, maintenance, community collaboration, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're talking about this today because open source has been on a trajectory. Now, I used to work with Simon. I worked with Simon at Canonical for a number of years, and we worked on cloud computing together. And my choice of slides is very much influenced on the way Simon presented, and I'm very influenced by speaking to pictures and many, many pictures. And when I was at Canonical, Simon and I were in a position where we were trying to persuade people to use open source. That is no longer needed. Nobody needs to persuade anybody to use open source, because whether you know you're using it or whether you are not, what you will find is that today open source is absolutely everywhere. And it's absolutely everywhere because of digitalization and a couple of other things that have happened in the last decade. And with digitalization, what you see is all organizations, whether they are from a, whether they're using software from a production perspective, a distribution perspective, or whether it's used to consume their products. You have digital technologies, software-defined technologies, which are requiring engineers and developers to work on them. And that means that the role of a developer has really, really shifted. It's been elevated hugely, and the developers have much more authority. So one of the problems Simon and I would have faced was that we would go and speak to a developer, they would want to use our open source code, and then we'd have to go through legal, procurement, finance. That doesn't happen anymore. And it doesn't happen anymore partly because the developers have more freedom, but also because the way that freedom is facilitated through GitHub. Now, if you were to look at GitHub comes, sorry, the chat's distracting me slightly. I'm going to just try and remove that till the end because I can't talk to you and give the presentation at the same time. So the evolution of GitHub from 2005 onwards has meant that public repositories are now utilized at scale, and that is absolutely fundamental to open source software. If you combine that with the elevated status of the open source software, what you find is that developers now go, help themselves to code, bring it into an organization, avoid having to go through legal, procurement, or finance because they don't need a contract signed off. The open source code is indeed shared on a standard OSI approved license, which means that from a licensing perspective, the standards don't need to be approved by legal. If you've got a smart legal team, what they'll have realized is that the risk has shifted away from contracting, and the risk now sits at the point of implementation or adoption within your organization, which means that your policy on open source and then your procedures that follow that are critical. And those procedures are actually the point where we see the public sector currently falling down, not thinking about more than that legal definition. So we've got this situation where we've got developers with an elevated status. We've got GitHub allowing them to bring open source software into their organizations. And then we've got infrastructure, platform, and cloud. And what we've seen is that as a consequence of the utilization of open source and cloud, open source adoption has just gone through the roof. Back in the day when Simon and I again were at Canonical, Microsoft was something called bug zero, and it was logged in a system at Canonical as bug zero, the destruction of Microsoft, the public enemy #1 to open source. And at that time, Steve Ballmer described open source as a cancer. We fast forward to 2018, and what you find is a very, very different world. So the FUD and the fights and the litigation have all passed. And in 2018, Steve Wally, my friend, is on stage here, keynoting in Edinburgh at the Open Source Summit. And he is talking about Microsoft's situation today. And Microsoft at that stage, I'm not sure year on year if this is still the same, but it will be around the same. Microsoft was the single biggest contributor to open source software. Now, he's speaking and he's got Satya Nadella behind him saying, judge us by the actions we've taken in the recent past, our actions today and in the future. So effectively asking forgiveness, asking to be judged as of this point in time and not for their past misdemeanors. Now, Steve explains that this has happened for 3 reasons, and this is really important, I think, because these 3 reasons are fundamental to the journey that all companies are on, whether they know it or like it. And they're all on a journey to open source adoption because of digitalization and because of the absolutely phenomenal rise in the adoption of open source in the last decade. And Steve explains the Microsoft journey, this journey that everybody's on a basis of 3 things. Firstly, there's been a shift, and today people ask for open source. Customers ask Microsoft for open source. Secondly, any developer who's learned to code in the last 20 years is going to use open source methodologies. It is just the norm. It is the way they work. And in a digitalized world, if you're not working on an open source basis, then you're not going to be able to attract those developers in a super competitive market. And then thirdly, cloud computing. And I've already mentioned this to you, but as Steve put it, they run something called Azure, and you can't run a cloud product without open source. And that means not just using it, but engaging with the open source community. Now, in the UK, we actually, Claire mentioned Liam Maxwell was speaking this morning. I was on a Cabinet Office advisory to Liam back in 2009, I think. And from that evolved this open first strategy that Liam, Mike Bracken and Francis Maud were very much behind. And this strategy has been world leading and implemented in many other countries. We saw last year GDS being 10 years old, government digital services, all part and parcel of this same thinking. And as I've mentioned already, through lockdown, we saw an acceleration of digitalization, but it was a really good opportunity, I think, to look at what our interaction and what our relationship with government is and how that's affected by technology. And I don't just mean apps. So Test and Trace, Ireland did a very good job there. I'm not going to hold the UK out as having a good job. Although, Claire, I'm not sure that I agree with the statement that what was it you said, if governments are failing, there will be an uprising. I would have thought that would have happened long ago in many countries, but there we go. Anyway, back to the plot. We saw through lockdown an acceleration in technology being used, particularly at an app level, by and around governments. And what we saw with that was the fact that as individuals, as the citizens in the state that Claire was talking about, our interaction with technology, with the public sector technology, comes through apps like Test and Trace. However, that's not the whole story. And sitting behind that in the health service is open data and massive infrastructure. The UK's energy sector, the Digitalisation Task Force, which reported in January, which I was an advisor to, specifically asks for a digital spine. And it gets to a stage where Atlantic Council's Chimney Sharma is talking about digital infrastructure and the scale of digital infrastructure and the adoption of open source in it as a house of cards. Now, that's something I'll come to in a second. So what I mean by this is that in a digitalized world like the one we're talking about, it's not just the enterprise that's adopting technology and software, it's the public sector. And what that means is our national infrastructure and our national critical infrastructure is today being built in open source software. And here's where the maps come in. So I mentioned the Biden ordinance. Back in May 2021, we saw an ordinance come out of the White House talking about software security. And there was a comment in the chat earlier that I think is quite misleading, singling out open source software when it comes to security. All software is vulnerable, all software is insecure. And in a digitalized world, that means that everything is insecure and we have to manage it. Personally, I believe that if the code is open and we can have a collaborative response when there's problems, that's a much better approach. We know when things are going wrong, we understand what they are, and we work together to fix them. Who knows what goes on in the dark? But going back to the Biden ordinance, it not only deals with proprietary software, but specifically with open source. And the way it deals with it is talking about supply chain. And when it talks about supply chain, it talks about having a software bill of materials. Now, this is only one piece in the picture, of course, but it's a good start. And there were a couple of people working in the White House, in particular, a software developer called Dave Ricordan, who is ex-Facebook, who's a long-term open source contributor. And you can really see when you read that Biden ordinance that somebody who's understood what they're doing was, inputting into it, somebody who understood open source well. It's the first thing I've ever seen from a government that this language is completely right. And then after Biden's ordinance, we really see government start to focus because we see Log4j. And Log4j had a vulnerability called Shell4j, which affected over 3 billion users globally. And there's been a response to that software vulnerability. That response has been massive amounts of funding from international companies and organizations going into a strategic plan to start to build 10 different work streams around things like education, taking it in all sorts of different directions. And you can see the review from NCSC there. This is something that on Monday we're going to be talking about, and we're going to be talking in a day-long session in London with the public sector, with government, and with some key speakers. That is not being streamed, but it is being recorded and will be shared with you. Now, the point of explaining this to you, to get to the sort of the nitty-gritty, is that when you use open source, it's not like using proprietary. I've talked about the definitions that government use being too limited and too focused on the economics. But actually what we're starting to see, and we've had 2 new pieces of legislation, a US proposed regulation 2 weeks ago, and the EU Cyber Act, both of which are following through to deliver this. And what they're following through to deliver is curation. Now, curation is the act of implementing open source software in an appropriate way and making sure that it's maintained and secure for the long term. When you take proprietary software, you pay a royalty, you pay a license fee, and that fee that you're paying comes with a package of services effectively. You can buy maintenance, you can be sure that it's going to be looked after, you hope, in a secure way. When you take open source software, you're taking it on that open source license that I know there's some comments in the chat about. But one thing all these OSI approved licenses have in common is that you take it without liability. So you, the user, are responsible for how you choose to implement and manage that open source software. It comes to you without liability. And if you use it in a regulated space, it's up to you, but you're responsible for the regulation. Now, if you're using it in national infrastructure, national and critical infrastructure, as a government, you, the government or public sector, are responsible for that. I'm going to flip over this slightly because I want to go back to the point I was making there about government responsibility. And I think as you're mapping, and mapping is something that I have Simon coming to speak to us about on Monday as part of our supply chain discussion, because mapping is going to be critical to understand the supply chain. And when we talk about security, when we talk about curation, when we talk about use of open source software and responsibility of the public sector and governments, we are going to have to get in depth into that supply chain. And we do that through SBOMs, but we're also going to have to understand the bigger picture of supply chains. And that's where I think, at least in the short term, but probably for a number of years, there's going to be a real correlation and a need for interaction between the mapping community and the open source community. And that's why I'm really pleased to see that we're having this conversation today, and that there's going to be a general discussion now, I believe, on mapping and open source. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Amanda. So we are pretty much at time, but I think we can go over by about 5 minutes or so to have a group discussion here. So So yeah, so for me, one of my key questions to both of you is around open source communities. So they're commonly criticized as having a diversity problem.
Having what problem? A diversity?
Excuse me, a diversity problem. Yeah. So I'm wondering how we can encourage more inclusion across like all the different aspects, different dimensions of diversity: gender, ethnicity, age, experience, industry, etc.
Do you want to go, Claire, or will I?
Well, I mean, there's many different levers. I think this conversation has, there's often long panels on this, so might be hard to summarize. I'll just make the point that I think that on the map we talked about skills being one of the key drivers of making a successful open source, making open source more successful in government. I would say that also drives diversity. So if you actually had a broader, more awareness from more people about how they could get engaged, what projects were out there, in particular the social impact of those projects, because there have been correlations between increased diversity but more social purpose. So when you actually highlight the areas that have social impact, you can actually, there's been proven that you can actually increase the diversity of people involved in those projects.
I think that's really relevant and right, and I see that engagement in the work that we do. I'm going to say that I think it comes with owning the situation in your organizations. So within OpenUK, I try to be very blind to who people are and very, very focused on the skills they have and what they bring to the organization. And I think by not worrying about, maybe I'm taking an opposite approach from many people who are positively trying to bring women into things. But I try to find anybody who has talent, who is interested in doing something, and engage them. And I think when you look across OpenUK, not only do we have, I think we're about 30% or 40% female, as opposed to the usual 17 in open source, but we have a very, very high level of neurodiversity and other hidden diversity as well. So I can happily say that we are very much up there in terms of diversity in the UK.
Yeah, great. So yeah, perhaps something that the open source communities can actually look to. So look to examples, right, for inspiration. Yeah, so I'm wondering if we should go back to Claire, to your map. So you left off with like loads of different possibilities for areas that were ripe for investment.
Pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. It's like,
we're just going around going, we'll do everything.
So hard. It's like going into a sweet song, right? So
yeah, if you open that map up, Claire, when you open that Claire, when you open your map up, there's a point on it of frictions. And I thought that was interesting. And normally I would have talked about those after the open source definition, but obviously we had a short time today. But those frictions include things like standards, where the standards bodies currently are very dominated by certain companies who are pushing an agenda around standard essential patents. And there's a friction between those and the royalties that they generate and open source and the royalty-free model. You see that friction around the open source definition and some companies who've created open source not being happy with the revenue they've generated and wanting to shift to non-commercial usage. And then you see friction around things like protestware or the virus license, where people have ethical considerations that they want to impose on open source that don't fit within the definition. And I'm not somebody who's wedded to a definition because it's a definition. I just think it's a good base point and it creates certainty. And it's very broad for certain things for a reason, so that we can't close things down accidentally. But these points of friction, I hope there'll be some understanding, some deeper understanding, and some more to come out of that just from the discussion we've had.
Yeah, I would agree, Amanda. And I think I'll make a point that, sometimes we talk about friction like it's all bad. But I think there are sometimes genuine, some of the actual discussion outlined genuine, perhaps, areas, concerns that would need to be addressed if one was to go down an open route. And perhaps then, I think an exploratory session to actually bring out those opinions would be really, really good. I'm seeing in the chat here, there was a talk about do we go all open source if the underlying platform is open source? I would say that the overarching result of the group's discussion was that maybe there are scenarios where open source does not make sense in some scenarios, but actually examining that, not being black and white about it, but kind of looking at those gray areas and saying, what's a decision-making framework for that? I think that'd be hugely beneficial. Because
there definitely are. There definitely are situations. I don't think there are many, but there are some where open source will not work. And I think that process of analysis that a map gives you is a good tool to have for it. I think the supply chain piece though really needs mapping. And I know it's something I've talked to Simon about the work that's been going on in certain sectors already. But I think if you're trying to build things like software bills of materials and you're trying to build them specific to sectors, once you've created a map, you've got a guide for people to use. Yeah,
it's a very good point. And that would have been one of the top areas for investment that was identified among lots of others.
Right. So, Aaron, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I've unmuted you. I saw you had your hand up. So
yeah, I can jump in
very quickly. Yeah. So we've got 1 minute.
Hi, Claire and Amanda. Well, I guess my question is, and I've sort of spoken about this before, but what's the role of open and climate change, and where do you see the most focus, or what we should be focusing on to help the efforts there to sort of reduce emissions and make our digital world a little bit greener?
I know, Amanda, you've got low.
I was going to say, I'm going to jump in. This is a question for me. No, it's a really big topic for us. And we're lucky to have a broad area like policy that the organisation covers, which means that last year, COP26 being in the UK allowed us to really push our sustainability agenda. And I think that what you see by using open source software is that certain kinds of technology become available, which allow, from a carbon emissions perspective, massive reductions in the hardware that's needed to power compute. And in turn, that stops, I think it's about 70% of emissions in data center you can reduce through using open source with open hardware. Now, that's just one part of it. For us, sustainability is the much bigger picture of the Sustainable Development Goals. And when you start to look at the SDGs, you can group them and match them against the principles that sit behind open source software, behind open technology. And we've been working for the last year on V1, and V1 will need a lot more work of societal value metrics. So a way of measuring, when you look at different open technologies, how they fit against the SDGs, how get some sort of scorecard can be created for that, but taking the values of open source away from pure economic metrics, which I think is really important. And we see things like the ability for communities to learn how to develop, how to engineer, how to use something and contribute to it. I was with a chap from Nigeria, Samson Godi, in London just the other day, big open source advocate, and we were talking about this and how when you implement open source in countries in places like Africa, you don't just give them the technology and then leave them. What you do is you give them the technology and engage in a community and bring people into that community so that they learn skills. Those skills aren't just the engineering, it's the whole suite of skills, including the governance, including the community development, collaboration skills. And I think there's a sort of final point that I would raise, which is that I was at a sustainability conference yesterday and they don't know how to collaborate. And the open source communities have been collaborating for 10, 20 years with big companies and allowing competition between companies. And I think it really brings that to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, I fully support everything, Amanda, you just said. I'll add in one additional point, maybe that, in the context of being an open source advocate as well, I think that whole area of sustainability and climate change provides a scenario, a context for the map, for example, that sometimes reduces those friction points, that inertia, because it's just so urgent that we all do this together. Like there's no point in competing on
Claire,
solutions.
I hadn't thought about it, but once we've launched V1.0, which is the 16th of November in Edinburgh, in our second Open Technology for Sustainability Day, we will be looking for collaborators to work with us. And what I may do is pass that over to the maps people so that I can see if we can do something around that. Because as we evolve that into V2.0, etc., it'd be really nice to have some mapping of those.
This
Yeah.
is
Good idea.
something that Mark Craddock and I talked about a couple of years ago. Was starting to map the SDGs. So that's
Perfect.
something I know two people who would be very interested in getting involved. We're going to have to close it there.
Oh, sorry, can I make one short comment? No, all right. I'll do it in the chat. Oh,
Okay,
well,
yeah,
it was just on the collaboration skills. I'll just note as well that, that culture piece is as important. It was called out on the map. Sometimes InnerSource actually can be a pathway in that respect in terms of open source readiness from a culture perspective. So that was just a slight point on the comments.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Right, so thank you very much, both. I've really, really enjoyed this. So it's been great to have both of you speaking, and excellent discussion, great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all, but if you guys hop over into the chat for the government track, then we can take your questions there.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good